Well, welcome back to our series, Under Pressure, where we're discovering how to respond to the pressures of life in healthy and godly ways. Now, we've all kind of found ourselves under different pressures during different seasons of our lives. And we can probably look back and see how we've chosen to respond well to those pressures. And we can probably look back and see times when we've chosen to respond poorly. And honestly, that's to be expected because none of us are able to bat 1,000. And one of the more tense times in our lives, I'd have to argue, is when we feel like we've got everything dialed, and then all of a sudden, we lose control. We're all just kind of getting back into the swing of school schedules, and maybe you've got the schedule dialed in for your kids and for the family, and then all of a sudden, somebody in the family wants to play a new sport. And now you've got 2 more practices and a game every week, and it's completely messing up your order. Or maybe you found a new work rhythm that seems to be working well for you. Then all of a sudden, the boss adds another meeting to your weekly schedule, and you've got to rework the whole thing. Or maybe for you finally get your finances in order, but some of your hours at work get cut, and now you've got to go back to the drawing board completely. It could be any number of scenarios where the control we thought we had is taken away from us. We had a plan. We had a process. We were moving toward a preferred future or preferred outcome, a desirable destination. And suddenly, now that destination seems out of reach. Our plan is foiled. Our process is interrupted. What do we do in this scenario? Well, we try to gain back control. We try to gain back the control we lost. Our survival instinct is to gain back control whenever we feel like we've lost it, to gain back the control we had before we lost it. But in many situations, the control we think we have is only an illusion. See, when it comes to our future, we only have a sense of control. We never actually have control. Our circumstances aren't dictated solely by our own actions or decisions. And we can't gain back control of something we never actually had control of in the first place. But nevertheless, when we feel we've lost control, or when we've entered into a circumstance we can't control, we often feel helpless. We experience a deep hopelessness for our future. These are really the moments when the positive parts of life can become eclipsed by the negative circumstances we find ourselves in the middle of. When we are unable to see the light at the end of the tunnel, there's no perceived solution to the problem or relief to the pain or struggle that we find ourselves in. Sometimes when we're in this place, we are actually convinced we'll repeat the same season of life all over again. We feel doomed to make the same mistake or to repeat the same cycle again in the future. We can experience this overwhelming feeling of being trapped or tied to a failed outcome. It's almost like feeling stuck in a storm with no way out and with no hope that the storm will ever subside. I can actually remember being in a lightning storm for the first time as a kid. We were tent camping in eastern Washington up around Moses Lake, and I was about 14 years old. And I had seen plenty of lightning before, but I'd never really been in the middle of it. We saw this storm a long way off before we went to bed, and it was awesome to watch and look at from a distance. But in the middle of the night, I woke up to this storm being directly over the top of us. We were completely surrounded by this storm. The lightning was right over the top of us, and the thunder was hitting at the exact moment the fingers of electricity stretched across the entirety of the sky. There was no escaping this storm. It was dark, it was loud, and it was completely overwhelming us, physically and emotionally, all of the things. And we definitely were not in control of what was happening around us. In fact, the park rangers actually came out to our tents and had us come sleep in the clubhouse for the night. It wasn't safe for us to be sleeping outside under trees in the tents, so they welcomed us into the safety of the clubhouse. A clubhouse with walls, with insulation, a roof, and all of these things was sitting on a foundation that was built to withstand this kind of weather. Now, this may be a surprise to some of you listening today, but Jesus actually had something to say about storms. And what is perhaps his most famous sermon, known as the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells a parable. And in this parable, which is a made-up story that illustrates true principles, Jesus gives us a hint on how to weather storms of life that are outside of our control. Let's take a look at this record of Jesus telling this story that we find in the Gospel of Luke, starting in Luke chapter 6 and verse 46. Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say?" Okay, so this is important. Jesus is talking to those who are following him. These are his disciples. And he's asking them how they can call him Lord and still ignore what he has instructed them to do. Now Jesus can sometimes get a bad rap. People sometimes perceive him to be a power-hungry, controlling leader. And this statement he makes here could be seen as proof or support of that kind of perspective. But I really want us to pay attention to what he says next. Bring that perspective to the text and let Jesus' words from here tell us if he's after control or if he's actually out to protect us. He says this. He says, "As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like." He says, "They're like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent, the storm, struck that house but could not shake it." Why? Because it was well built. See, in the middle of a storm, what we hope for is to have the safety of a structure that's built on a firm foundation that will not be shaken by the uncontrollable circumstances that are currently overwhelming us. And Jesus is saying that those who trust in him deep enough to live as he's called us to live will have lives that cannot be shaken by the brokenness of the world in which we live. But, he says in verse 49, "But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation." He says the moment the torrent struck, that storm, that house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete. The only way to weather a storm is to have a foundation that's built to outlast the storm. And foundations are built from the beginning of construction, not after the storm hits. Foundations are laid at the foundation. This is a lot different from boarding up windows in response to the storm warning. It's preparation in advance for when the storm inevitably comes. There's a difference between preparing for a storm and responding to news that a storm is coming. And here's the reality for you and me in this broken world. A storm is either subsiding, it's presently overwhelming you, or it's imminently in front of you. We need to prepare long before we hear the distant cracks of thunder signaling the coming of a storm. You can set up a tent and hope you'll get through it, or you can build a clubhouse and be confident that you'll get through it. But this kind of foundation isn't built in a day, and it isn't dependent on our ability to build it ourselves. Jesus demonstrates for us what this foundation actually looks like in our lives. We often, when we read the Gospels, witness Jesus saying the same thing to his disciples in different ways, and then asking them why they didn't get it the first time. And honestly, a lot of these scenarios are callbacks to this sermon that's known as the Sermon on the Mount. Check out this situation that actually occurs in the middle of a storm. It's an opportunity for Jesus' disciples to display how deeply they trust in Jesus and to live out the teachings they have heard from him. And I think this actually gives us a pretty powerful picture of how we can navigate situational storms when we find ourselves in the midst of one. This particular event is recorded by Mark in his gospel. in Mark chapter 4. It says, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. It says, leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. It says, a furious squall, a storm came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Guys, the boat was nearly swamped. How many times have we responded to the question, hey, how are things? With the answer, man, I'm swamped. Many of us live lives in a constant state of being overwhelmed. Maybe it's work, maybe it's relational tensions, maybe it's life situations. But man, when it's the result of circumstances that are outside our control, when it's a storm that we didn't invite or a circumstance we didn't provoke, that sense of being swamped can be crippling. And what we want in those moments is to gain back control. But even that is only a surface level desire. We want to gain back control because we believe that if we had control, we could get what we deeply desire, which is confidence that we'll be able to survive the storm. We want to feel safe. We want to know that we will still get through to our destination. Now, the disciples were terrified at this point, and that's actually a big deal since many of his disciples were fishermen and were incredibly familiar with the sea and with boats. But Jesus seems to be unfazed by the squall swirling around them. It says this in verse 38. Jesus was in the stern sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care? Don't you care if we drown?" Man, when we sense that God is quiet, we often assume that he's distant. We may even assume that he doesn't care, that he's absent. But look at what Jesus does next. It says he got up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, to the storm, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. The disciples were out of control, but Jesus was never out of control. And even still, he's at work and in control of every aspect of our lives. Jesus responds again. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" It says that they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Why does Jesus ask them if they have no faith? Faith in what? What is Jesus referring to? Oftentimes I've read this and thought Jesus was asking them if they had faith in his ability to calm the storm, to gain back control, to rescue them from their circumstance. But Jesus was responding to a question the disciples asked him. They asked him, "Don't you care?" To which Jesus responds, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" How often do we allow our current circumstances to dictate whether or not we think God cares about us? How often do we fear God is distant simply because life isn't easy or our circumstances are actually out of control? The fear the disciples had seemed to be directed toward whether or not Jesus cared for them. But Jesus had already demonstrated time and time again that he certainly did care for them. And he would go on to demonstrate to the world how deep, how wide, and how long his love is for each and every one of us. The disciples were so busy being consumed by the circumstances swirling around them that they had forgotten who was in the boat with them. They had forgotten in the moment who it was they were following. They'd forgotten that Jesus was the source of their strength, the source of their hope, and the source of their peace. And just like the disciples, we can be swallowed up by our circumstances, or we can look to the one who's committed to being in our boat through the storm. It's not about our circumstances. It's about who's in our boat. And when we trust in Jesus, the foundation of our life isn't dependent on things going our way. It's dependent on the work Jesus has already done and completed on the cross. It's dependent on the fact that Jesus is with us in all things and through all things. So when life seems to be out of control, when the wind and the waves kick up, knowing that our foundation is solid because it's built on Jesus will give us the confidence we need to find hope in what seems like a hopeless situation. It's knowing that we have Jesus by our side to walk with us through the storm. That even when it might feel as if God is sleeping, he's actually at work. And we can depend on his faithfulness to carry us through whatever we face in front of us. Now, we never want to be oversimplistic in how we talk about the pressures of life. And while Sunday messages and teachings are meant to encourage and to direct our hearts and our minds to Jesus as the source, there are so many layers and nuanced circumstances and experiences that just can't be properly addressed or represented in a setting like this one. So we've actually put together what we hope to be some really helpful resources that are available outside of just our Sunday messages for this series. And I want to highlight a couple of them this week. And one of those includes all the opportunities across all our campuses to join community. These are smaller circles of people doing life together during the week. And in any of our community opportunities, you'll be able to dialogue with other people about your life. You'll be able to ask questions and share stories in a much more meaningful way than we're able to do online, or even than we're able to do in person on a Sunday. So check out these opportunities at one of our campuses, whichever one is closest to you. We're also hosting at each of our campuses some more intentional presentations around some topics we'll cover on Sunday mornings. This is what we're calling our Under Pressure Lab. This includes 3 separate sessions happening in person during different time slots at each of our campuses, where a pastor or licensed counselor will share helpful information and care resources around some of these specific topics. You can click on the link below for the lab to see the topics and times that are available. And definitely do not hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. And the last resource I want to share with you is our counseling referral list. There are counselors that we vetted in the area of each of our campuses. And man, there's many scenarios where counseling and therapy can be incredibly helpful in navigating the hurt, the pain, the trauma, even addiction, and many other things that we experience as a result of living in a broken world. And as a church, we don't want to just point each other back to Jesus. We also want to come alongside and walk with one another as we learn to heal and find hope in the midst of life. If any of these resources are something you're interested in, please reach out to us and we'll make sure to get you connected. As you just are processing all of this, I pray that you'll find hope in Jesus. I pray you find peace because of who is actually with you. And I pray that you can continue to build the foundation of your life on the person and the teachings of Jesus. For ultimately, he's the hope we need in all of our hopeless situations. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you that you are with us through all things and in all things. Thank you for the fact that we are not alone. God, that not only you're with us, but God, that we are a part of a community, a church community who wants to come alongside each other as we walk through these pressures of life. God, may we be bold enough to place our trust and our faith in you. And may we be bold enough to share our lives and our concerns and our fears with each other so that we can experience what it means to follow you, to trust in you, and to receive the goodness from you that you have for each of us. We love you, and we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm so glad that you joined us today. We look forward to being able to just walk alongside each other as we continue to learn how to respond when we find ourselves under pressure. We love you guys. Have a great week.